Okay, so in this video, we are going to discuss properties of water. This is for AP Biology, topic 1.1. But before we can talk about water, let's go ahead and review some bonds that are going to be important for understanding biology in the first couple units of the year. So the first one's going to be ionic bonds. Now, ionic bonds are when atoms transfer electrons, and the key here is that they are going to result in charged particles or ions that will attract each other. So like sodium chloride. Sodium has that positive charge and chloride has that negative charge. Now these ions with the positive charge and a negative charge actually can interact with water molecules. We'll see later in our PowerPoint how water is a polar molecule with partial positive and partial negative regions that then can also interact with ions. So ionic bonds are important in a discussion of biology. Then we have covalent bonds. Now, covalent bonds we're going to see a lot in the rest of Unit 1, where molecules are going to, or atoms are going to share electrons to achieve basically a stable configuration. However, the key here is that sharing of electrons. As we continue through topic 1, we'll see how covalent bonds are formed between molecules to form large macromolecules. So covalent bonds are pretty stable, strong bonds in biology, which is maybe a little bit opposite from what you learned about in chemistry. And then we have our hydrogen bonds. Covalent bonds actually have two different kinds. We have polar and nonpolar covalent bonds, so we can discuss those. And then we have hydrogen bonds, which are weak attractions between two molecules, usually a hydrogen that's partially positively charged and a very electronegative atom of another molecule. In this case, of two water molecules being attracted to each other, forming hydrogen bonds, it's between the partial positive hydrogen of one and the partial negative oxygen of another water molecule. So here, these are weaker attractions, and they actually will form and break trillions of times per second. And so, yeah. Now, let's go ahead, though, and talk about covalent bonds before we move on, and really talk about the difference between polar and nonpolar covalent bonds. So in nonpolar covalent bonds, these are where those shared electrons are shared equally. And so therefore, there is no partial charge anywhere on that molecule. You can kind of think of it as the two nuclei in that bond between the shared electrons are tugging on the electrons equally. And therefore, it's like a tug-of-war that ends up in a tie. Now, this is due to the fact that they have similar electronegativities. So let's just quickly talk about what electronegative means. So when we talk about electronegative atoms, their measure of electronegativity is really how strongly their nucleus attracts electrons. So you can kind of think of it as a magnetic pull on electrons in the sharing during a covalent bond. So this actually, if you have a covalent bond between two atoms where one of the nuclei is more electronegative, it will have a stronger pull on those shared electrons, and that will result in one part of the molecule having a partial positive region and another part of the molecule having a partial negative region. You can kind of think of it as a tug-of-war where there's an unequal pulling, and so one side pulls more or attracts more those electrons, resulting in a partial negative side. So if we were to compare and contrast the two, polar covalent bonds involve an unequal sharing of electrons, whereas non-polar covalent bonds, the electrons are shared equally. Now, so they're both sharing electrons. However, one is going to have some partial positive and partial negative regions, whereas a non-polar molecule, all of the electrons are shared equally, resulting in no partial charges anywhere on that molecule. All right. So now water is a molecule that is polar. It is due to its polar covalent bonds. Now, oxygen is one of the most electronegative atoms, and therefore the nucleus in oxygen is going to pull greater on those shared electrons that the oxygen is sharing with hydrogen. So if you watch my PowerPoint, you can see here how oxygen is going to pull more strongly on those electrons, which then results in the oxygen side of the molecule having a partial negative region and the hydrogens having a partial positive region. So if you need to read that, you can. So then let's go ahead and talk about water. So water is a polar molecule, and it's because of its polar covalent bonds that result in partial positive and partial negative regions. But now let's go ahead and talk about how then water molecules interact with each other with these partial charges. So if you have a water molecule here, now I want you to think, will the second water molecule, will the two partial negative sides interact with each other? No, right? Like similar charges are going to repel and opposites attract. So here, the top water molecule will actually have the partial positive hydrogen will be attracted to the partial negative oxygen of a separate water molecule. Now, this attraction is what we call a hydrogen bond. It's a weak attraction between two separate molecules. So the partial positive pull of one water molecule will form a weak attraction to the partial negative pull of another water molecule. Now this right here is the hydrogen bond. Keep in mind there's no transfer of electrons, ionic bonds. There's no sharing of electrons, which is what we see in covalent bonds. So there's our hydrogen bond. Now these areas here that I've highlighted where the oxygen is bonded to hydrogen and they are sharing electrons, just not equally, that area is our polar covalent bonds within a single water molecule. Okay, so when we look at water and how it interacts, we can see that there's quite a bit of hydrogen bonds that form and break all the time between water molecules. Okay, so now when we look at hydrogen bonds, this is just a nice summary. You can things I've already said multiple times. So you have your partial positive hydrogen attracted to your partial negative oxygen of a separate water molecule. All right. And those pink areas are our hydrogen bonds. Now, these hydrogen bonds are going to lead to different properties of water. So we have cohesion, adhesion, high heat capacity, and surface tension that we're going to talk about. We'll also talk about heat of vaporization and why ice floats. So when we talk about cohesion, this is referring to the tendency of water molecules to stick together due to hydrogen bonding. So the attraction of water to water is due to hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. So that is cohesion. Then we have something similar. We have what's called adhesion, but this is the ability of water to stick to other surfaces or attract to other surfaces. So if we're thinking, well, what kind of surface would it attract to? It's probably going to attract to another polar surface or a surface with ions, right? And so we can kind of think about how those partial positive or partial negative regions of water will then opposites attract to other kind of either partially charged items, molecules, or direct things with charges. All right, so here if we think about this like maybe it's a blade of grass or a stem of a plant here, we can obviously see that there's water forming on this plant. And so when we think about, well, why? Like how is that water sticking to water? Right? That's going to be cohesion, but it's also sticking to the plant. Well, plants are made, like the cell walls are made of cellulose, and cellulose is a polar molecule. So therefore, we can see how that water droplet would adhere to the cellulose in that plant cell walls. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about high heat capacity and how it relates to like biology. So I know in chemistry class, you probably learned about the high heat capacity of water and how it takes like how much heat is required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius, right? But how does that relate to life? When we think about life, especially life that lives in water, whether it's oceans or lakes or streams or ponds, the fact that water can absorb a lot of energy from the sun, and that energy can be absorbed and used to break and then have hydrogen bonds reform. So that energy is being absorbed, but because it's being like absorbed by, I guess, the hydrogen bonds. That's not true. Heat energy from the sun disrupts the hydrogen bonds between molecules of water. And because it disrupts them, they form almost as quickly. So heat energy from the sun is used up, breaking and reforming hydrogen bonds, and the water temperature therefore doesn't rise very much, which then creates a kind of like nice stable environment within that water habitat. So there's less fluctuations, I guess, between night and day. I mean, will the water cool at night? Probably a little bit, but it doesn't raise and lower too dramatically because of water's high heat capacity. Now, water also has a high heat of vaporization, which is important in evaporative cooling, which will be in a couple slides. Now, the resistance to this sudden change in temperature allows water to be an excellent habitat without large temperature fluctuations. And if we also think about how, as like mammals and animals, a large percentage of our body is water, and therefore the fact that it can absorb a lot of heat, whether it's heat we create ourselves by our mitochondria or heat from the environment, it helps us to also thermoregulate and maintain kind of constant internal body temperatures. Now, when we talk about capacity, we can also talk about heat of vaporization, where heat of vaporization is going to be the conversion of water from a liquid to a gas. So basically, when we think about water evaporating. And so this is important for evaporative cooling. And so when we think about this, like if I were to exercise, I'm going to generate a lot of heat within my body. So my water in my bloodstream can try and like help me regulate that by absorbing some of that heat. But at the same time, I'm going to sweat. And so sweat is crucial for cooling down our body temperatures. And so when we sweat, the water molecules on the surface of our skin are going to absorb the heat from our body and become energized. So these energized water molecules can break hydrogen bonds and evaporate into the air, carrying the heat away in the process. This helps us cool our bodies down and regulate our body temperatures and prevent it from rising to dangerous levels. This is also why when it's really humid outside, it's hard to cool off because your sweat isn't really evaporating as much. Okay, and then we have transpiration is another important biological process that does involve both evaporation and adhesion and cohesion. So when we look at water and how it moves against gravity from the soil all the way up through the leaves and then evaporates into the air, I want you to think about this chain of water molecules up this tree. Now, water flows within tubes called xylem. I said that weird, sorry. Xylem. And so xylem, you can think of them as like straws, and they are made of cellulose on the inside. And so when water like evaporates from leaves, so when the wind comes in and the wind blows, what's going to happen is the water molecules at the surface of that leaf are going to evaporate. And as they evaporate, those cohesive properties between water molecules are going to pull the chain of water up from the soil, maybe hundreds of feet to the top of feet, hundreds of feet to the top of trees. And so when one water molecule evaporates, in this picture here, you can see the partial negative oxygen is hydrogen bonded to the partial positive hydrogen of the water molecule below it. So when the water molecule evaporates, it causes like a chain reaction of pulling the water up from the soil, and that is how water moves against gravity up hundreds of feet to the surface of trees. To the leaves of trees, and then evaporates into the air. Oh, and then we have surface tension. So surface tension is really about the interaction between water and air. And so when we look at that air-water interface, the water molecules at the surface are going to form stronger hydrogen bonds with each other because they're not bonding with the air. And so it creates a stronger hydrogen bonding, like a effect, I guess, at that air surface interface. And that allows some lightweight organisms like insects to be able to like land on water and not break through the surface of the water. And then we have our last topic is ice versus liquid water and why ice may float, why it does float. So when we think about liquid water, there are hydrogen bonds constantly forming and rebreaking. Whereas when those water molecules begin to cool down and as it approaches 0 degrees Celsius, these hydrogen bonds are going to form and the water molecules are going to spread out. And as water reaches its crystalline structure, the water molecules are more spaced no, that's how you correctly say it, compared to when it's in liquid form, and therefore it becomes less dense. Now, why this is significant is because when you have a less dense solid water, ice, right, it's going to float. And now that means during winter time, when there's rivers, I don't know if rivers really freeze, but when maybe rivers or lakes or bodies of water freeze, that frozen ice is going to float, which allows life to still exist below, and they can survive through winter. So that is my summary on water and a quick review of chemistry, and I hope it was helpful.